The ocean stretched endlessly before me, its waves shimmering under the late morning sun. The salty breeze brushed against my skin as I stood behind the small windbreaker we had set up earlier, trying to peel off the damp bikini that clung to me. It was supposed to be a quiet, solitary moment, a chance to dry off and change into something comfortable before heading back to the house. But the sticky fabric resisted my every effort, twisting and pulling in all the wrong ways as I fumbled to free myself. I reached for the loose sundress draped over the chair, slipping it over my head with a sigh of relief. The familiar softness of the fabric was a welcome change after the clingy swimsuit. I smoothed the dress down over my hips, but as I was adjusting the straps, I heard his voice. Meredith? I froze, my heart lurching in my chest as I turned to see Liam standing just beyond the edge of the windbreaker. His dark hair was tousled by the breeze, his sun-kissed skin glowing under the bright light. "Liam," I stammered, my hands instinctively flying to my chest. His eyes widened slightly, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I hadn't fully pulled the neckline of my dress into place. I tugged at the fabric hastily, my cheeks burning as I tried to cover myself. Sorry," he said, his voice catching as he quickly turned his back to me. "No, it's fine," I said, though my voice was anything but steady. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I didn't mean to startle you," he said over his shoulder, his tone apologetic but slightly strained. We stood there for a moment, the sound of the waves filling the awkward silence. My mind raced, trying to shake off the embarrassment and figure out what to say. "It's okay," I said finally, forcing a laugh. "You just caught me at a bad time." Liam turned back slowly, his expression cautious. "I should have knocked, or, I guess, called out sooner. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, waving him off. But the way his eyes lingered on me, even for just a fraction of a second, left me feeling unsteady. Liam had always been attentive, ever since I married his father years ago. When Bill passed away, Liam had stepped into the role of caretaker without hesitation, checking in on me, fixing things around the house, and insisting I join him for family gatherings even when I tried to decline. He was thoughtful, steady, and reliable in a way that often reminded me of Bill. But lately, there had been something different about him. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was in the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing me for the first time. It was in the way his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary when he passed me a plate or helped me out of the car. And now, standing here in the middle of this unexpectedly awkward moment, I couldn't ignore the tension simmering between us. "I was just coming to check if you wanted lunch," Liam said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "Oh," I said, grateful for the distraction. "That sounds nice." He nodded, his usual easygoing smile returning as if to reassure me. "There's a little cafe down the road. I can grab something for us to take back to the house if you'd like." "That'd be great," I said, finally managing a genuine smile. "Okay," he said, lingering for a moment before turning to leave. "I'll be back soon." As he walked away, his shoulders relaxed, but I could still feel the faint tension in the air between us. I sank into the beach chair, my heart still racing as I stared out at the waves. What had just happened? It was such a small moment, a silly misunderstanding that should have been easy to brush off. And yet, I couldn't shake the look in Liam's eyes, or the way it had made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted between us. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to ignore it. Liam returned about an hour later, carrying 2 neatly wrapped sandwiches and a pair of iced teas. He found me on the deck of the small beach house, reclining on one of the weathered lounge chairs, a paperback novel resting idly in my lap. "You look comfortable," he said, setting the bag down on the small table between us. I replied with a smile, though I felt anything but relaxed. My mind had been spinning since our earlier encounter, replaying the moment over and over in frustrating detail. "Well, I figured we could eat out here," he said, handing me a sandwich. "Can't beat the view." I nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the moment. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop as we unwrapped our food and settled into a quiet rhythm. For a while, we didn't talk much, letting the easy silence fill the space between us. But as we finished eating, Liam leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting out over the water. "This place hasn't changed much," he said softly. "No, it hasn't," I agreed, following his gaze. He glanced at me, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Do you remember the time Dad insisted on building that bonfire out here, even though it was so windy?" I laughed, the memory coming back in vivid detail. How could I forget? He spent more time chasing the flames than actually building the fire. "And then he burned the marshmallows," Liam added, shaking his head. "Completely black," I said, smiling despite the sudden ache in my chest. We fell silent again, the weight of the memory settling between us. Liam's father, my husband, Bill, had been gone for 4 years now, but moments like this made it feel like he was still here, his presence lingering in the stories we shared. "You miss him," Liam said quietly, his voice gentle. I nodded, my throat tightening. "Every day." He reached over, his hand covering mine. The gesture was familiar, comforting, but there was a softness in his touch that made my breath hitch. "I think he'd be happy to see us here," he said, his voice steady. I looked at him, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. "You think so?" "I know so," he said, his hand lingering on mine for a moment longer before he pulled away. As the afternoon stretched on, we found ourselves slipping into the kind of easy conversation that had always come naturally to us. Liam told me about his job, his plans to take on a new project, and a funny story about a coworker who'd managed to lock himself out of his car 3 times in 1 week. I laughed more than I had in months, the sound surprising even me. For the first time in a long time, I felt light, like the weight I'd been carrying had momentarily lifted. But there was something else, too. Something unspoken in the way Liam looked at me, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long, or the way his voice softened when he said my name. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things. But the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Liam suggested a walk along the beach. I hesitated at first, but the idea of moving, of doing something to distract myself, was too tempting to resist. We walked side by side, our feet sinking into the cool sand as the waves lapped at the shore. The conversation was light at first, memories of family vacations, stories from his childhood, but as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, the tone shifted. "You've been quiet lately," Liam said, glancing at me. "Have I?" I asked, though I knew he was right. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot," he said softly. "I just want to make sure you're okay." I hesitated, my chest tightening. "I'm figuring things out," I said finally. "That's okay," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to have all the answers right now." The kindness in his tone made my throat tighten, and I looked away, focusing on the horizon. As we turned back toward the house, the wind picked up and I shivered slightly. Without a word, Liam slipped off his light jacket and draped it over my shoulders. "Thanks," I said softly, pulling it tighter around me. He smiled, his hand brushing against mine as we walked. The contact was brief, but it sent a ripple of warmth through me, and I felt my pulse quicken despite myself. Back at the house, the tension that had been building all day seemed to linger in the air between us. Liam paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame as he turned to look at me. "Good night, Meredith," he said, his voice low. "Good night," I replied, my heart pounding as I watched him walk to his room. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing. The connection between us was undeniable, but the thought of what it meant, of what it could mean, was almost too much to bear. As I lay in bed that night, the sound of the waves outside lulling me to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The next morning, the light filtering through the windows carried the promise of another warm day. I found Liam in the kitchen, already brewing coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. "Good morning," he said with a smile that seemed to soften the edges of the quiet unease I had woken up with. "Good morning," I replied, sitting at the small wooden table. He poured me a cup and set it in front of me, before leaning against the counter, his presence filling the room in a way that felt both comforting and disarming. "I was thinking," he began, his tone casual, "we could take the kayaks out today." It's been a while since I've seen you on the water. I hesitated, the idea tempting but nerve-wracking. I'm not sure I remember how, I admitted. I'll teach you, he said, his smile turning playful. It'll be fun, promise. And with that, the decision was made. The bay was calm, the water glistening under the mid-morning sun as we dragged the kayaks down to the shore. Liam steadied mine as I climbed in, his hands firm but gentle as he held the vessel steady. You've got this, he said, his voice reassuring as he pushed me off into the shallow water. For the first few minutes I fumbled with the paddle, struggling to find a rhythm, but Liam stayed close, his own kayak gliding effortlessly alongside mine as he offered quiet encouragement. Relax your shoulders, he said, his voice calm. Let the paddle do the work. I followed his advice, and soon enough I found myself gliding through the water with ease. See, he said, his smile widening. Told you it'd come back to you. I laughed, the sound echoing across the bay. Okay, you were right, I admitted. We paddled farther out, the houses on the shore growing smaller as the water deepened into a rich, endless blue. Liam led the way to a small cove sheltered by rocky cliffs, the kind of spot you'd only find if you knew exactly where to look. This is beautiful, I said, my voice hushed as I took in the view. I thought you'd like it, he replied, his kayak drifting closer to mine. We floated there for a while, the water lapping gently against the kayaks as we talked about everything and nothing. The tension from the day before seemed to dissolve in the sunlight, replaced by an easy closeness that felt like slipping into an old familiar rhythm. But as we made our way back to shore, something shifted. Liam's kayak drifted close to mine, and as he reached out to steady me against an unexpected current, his hand brushed against mine. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a ripple through me, and I found myself glancing at him. His gaze met mine, steady and unflinching, and for a moment it felt like the world around us had gone still. Meredith, he began, his voice soft but certain. I looked away quickly, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. We should head back, I said, my voice trembling. Right, he said after a moment, though the tension in his voice was impossible to miss. Back at the house, the air between us felt heavier, charged with an unspoken energy that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing lunch while Liam lingered in the living room, flipping aimlessly through a magazine. Do you need help? He asked eventually, his voice carrying into the kitchen. No, I've got it, I replied, though my hands trembled slightly as I chopped vegetables. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. You sure? He asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. I nodded, focusing on the task in front of me. But when he stepped closer, reaching for a knife to help slice the bread, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced at his proximity. As we worked side by side, the tension between us grew almost unbearable. Every accidental brush of our hands, every fleeting glance, felt charged with something neither of us dared to name. At one point, as I reached for a plate, Liam's hand covered mine. I froze, my breath catching as I looked up at him. Meredith, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The air between us felt electric, and I found myself leaning ever so slightly toward him before I caught myself and stepped back. I should finish this, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Right, he said, his hand dropping back to his side. That evening, after dinner, Liam suggested a bonfire on the beach. I'll set it up, he said, already gathering the supplies. I followed him down to the shore, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin as the sun dipped below the horizon. Liam built the fire with practiced ease, the flames crackling to life as the sky darkened. We sat together on the sand, the warmth of the fire a sharp contrast to the coolness of the night air. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular, the conversation light and easy, but as the fire burned lower, the mood shifted once again. I'm glad we did this, Liam said, his voice soft. Me too, I replied, though my chest tightened at the weight of the moment. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. I meant what I said earlier, he said. You've been quiet lately. I just want to make sure you're okay. I'm fine, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. Meredith, he said, his voice low but insistent. You don't have to pretend with me. His words broke something loose inside me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted finally. You don't have to figure it out alone, he said, his hand covering mine. The closeness between us felt overwhelming, and as the fire crackled softly, I found myself leaning toward him. Liam, I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I'm here, he said softly, his gaze holding mine. For a moment I let myself believe him. The following morning the house was eerily quiet. The steady rhythm of the waves outside felt like a heartbeat, a reminder of the tension lingering between us after the bonfire. I busied myself tidying the kitchen, wiping down the counters even though they were spotless. I told myself I was overthinking everything, that the moments between Liam and me were just that. Moments. Fleeting. Meaningless. But deep down, I knew better. When Liam emerged from his room, his hair still damp from a shower, he carried that same easy confidence he always did. He offered me a smile, but there was something softer in his eyes. Good morning, he said, his voice warm. Morning, I replied, my heart racing even at the simplest exchange. I was thinking we could head into town today, he said, leaning against the counter. Grab some lunch, maybe check out the market. It was such a casual suggestion, but the way his gaze lingered on me made it feel like an invitation to something more. By late afternoon, we found ourselves wandering through the small seaside market, the salty breeze mingling with the scent of fresh flowers and grilled seafood. Liam stayed close, his presence steady and comforting as we moved from stall to stall. At one point, I reached for a small necklace at a jewelry stand, a simple pendant shaped like a seashell. It suits you, Liam said, his voice low. I looked at him, my cheeks warming under his gaze. You think so? He nodded, his eyes soft. Definitely. I hesitated, but before I could decide whether to buy it, Liam handed cash to the vendor and slipped the necklace into my hand. Liam, I began, but he shook his head. Just take it, he said, his lips curving into a smile. Consider it a thank you for coming here with me. I slipped the necklace into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cool metal as we continued through the market. By the time we returned to the house, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I was tired but content, the unease of the morning replaced by a quiet warmth I couldn't quite name. After dinner, Liam suggested another walk on the beach. I promise I won't keep you out too late, he teased, his grin boyish. I laughed softly, nodding. Okay, just a quick one. The beach was nearly empty, the last traces of daylight fading into the horizon as we strolled along the shore. The cool sand shifted beneath my feet, and the sound of the waves felt soothing, almost hypnotic. Liam walked beside me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the water. I'm glad we did this, he said after a while, his voice quiet. Me too, I replied, though my chest tightened at the weight of the moment. He stopped walking, turning to face me. Meredith, he began, his tone careful. I need to say something. I froze, my heart pounding as I looked at him. He hesitated, his hands sliding out of his pockets. I don't know when it started, he said, his voice low, but I can't stop thinking about you. Liam, I whispered, my voice trembling. I know this is complicated, he continued, his gaze never leaving mine, but I can't ignore how I feel. And I don't think you can either. The air between us felt impossibly thick, and I struggled to find the right words. It's not something we can just... Why not? He interrupted gently, stepping closer. Why can't we? We're both adults. We know what this is. What if it's wrong? I asked, my voice barely audible. What if it's right? He countered, his eyes searching mine. The simplicity of his question left me speechless, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, he said softly. I just need you to know how I feel. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I stepped closer, my hand reaching for his. Liam, I whispered, my voice breaking. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. Just tell me one thing, he said, his voice steady. Do you feel it too? Yes, I admitted, the word tumbling out before I could stop it. Relief washed over his face, and he leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tentative and filled with a quiet intensity. The world around us seemed to fade as the kiss deepened, the sound of the waves and the cool night air fading into the background. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer as I wrapped my arms around his neck. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Every nerve, every emotion, every part of me fully awake and present in the moment. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as the weight of what had just happened settled over us. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It doesn't have to," Liam said softly. "We can take this one step at a time." I nodded, though the fear still lingered at the edges of my mind. "Okay," I said finally. We walked back to the house in silence, the tension between us replaced by a quiet understanding. When we reached the door, Liam turned to me, his expression soft. "Good night, Meredith," he said, his voice low. "Good night," I replied, my heart pounding as I watched him step inside. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way his touch had made me feel. I knew we'd crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. But for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next morning, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the silence louder, as though the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had happened between Liam and me. I lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, staring at my coffee mug as if it held the answers I so desperately needed. My mind replayed the night before on an endless loop. The way his lips had felt against mine, the way his hands had steadied me, grounding me in a moment that felt impossibly right and terrifyingly wrong all at once. The sound of Liam's footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his expression careful. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, though my voice barely carried. He stepped into the room, his movements tentative, as though he was afraid to disturb the fragile equilibrium between us. "I was thinking we could spend the day in," he said. "Maybe just relax." I nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the suggestion. "That sounds nice." We spent the morning in the living room, the television on but largely ignored as we sat on opposite ends of the couch. The space between us felt both vast and impossibly small, the unspoken tension crackling like static in the air. At one point, Liam reached for the remote, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks flushing. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low. "It's fine," I said, though my pulse was racing. We fell silent again, the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on us. By the afternoon, the tension had become unbearable. I retreated to the deck, needing space to think, to breathe. The ocean stretched out before me, its endless expanse both comforting and overwhelming. I didn't hear Liam approach until he was standing beside me, his presence as steady and unyielding as the tide. "Meredith," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the seriousness in his expression. "We can't keep dancing around this," he said, his tone careful but firm. "I know," I admitted, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Talk to me," he said. "Please." I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "I don't know how to do this," I said finally. "You don't have to," he said, his voice gentle. "We'll figure it out together." "But what if?" He cut me off, his hand reaching for mine. "What if it works?" he asked, his tone insistent. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Liam, this is so much more complicated than you realize." "I know exactly how complicated it is," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I don't care. I care about you." The raw honesty in his words broke something loose inside me, and before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, my hand reaching for his. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Relief washed over his face, and he lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles. "This doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "It just has to be real." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Liam suggested a movie. We sat on the couch, the space between us gradually shrinking until his arm found its way around my shoulders. I leaned into him, my head resting against his chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to let go of the fear, if only for a little while. But as the movie played on, I felt his fingers brushing against my arm, the touch sending a shiver down my spine. "Meredith," he murmured, his voice soft but insistent. I looked up at him, my heart pounding as his gaze held mine. I can't stop thinking about you, he said, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, he leaned down, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. This time I didn't pull away. I let myself sink into the moment, into him, the world around us fading until all that remained was the warmth of his touch and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. We didn't stop there. The boundaries we had carefully maintained crumbled completely, leaving us vulnerable and exposed in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Liam's hands were gentle but sure as he pulled me closer, his touch igniting a fire that had long been dormant. Every kiss, every caress, felt like a promise, a reassurance that we weren't alone in this. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the glow of the television casting soft shadows across the room. "Are you okay?" Liam asked, his voice low and filled with concern. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so," I said, though my voice trembled. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. "We'll figure this out," he said. As the night stretched on, I found myself drifting between fear and hope, the two emotions warring for control. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something, instead of standing still. When Liam finally left to go to his room, he kissed me softly at the door, his touch lingering as though he didn't want to let go. "Good night," he said, his voice warm. "Good night," I replied, my chest tightening as I watched him walk away. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the day. The doubts were still there, whispering at the edges of my mind, but they were quieter now, overshadowed by the quiet certainty that Liam had given me. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains in my room, casting golden streaks across the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hair was still mussed from the night before, and my thoughts felt just as tangled. The events of the previous evening replayed in my mind with vivid clarity. Liam's touch, his words, the way he'd looked at me as though I was the only person in the world who mattered, all of it was undeniable. And yet, the weight of what we had done pressed down on me, filling my chest with equal parts exhilaration and dread. I heard footsteps in the hallway and glanced at the door just as Liam appeared, leaning against the frame with an easy, familiar smile. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Morning," I replied, my voice soft. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and overwhelming. "I made coffee," he said. "Thanks," I said, standing and smoothing the hem of my robe. "I'll be out in a minute." Liam nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned and left. In the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the salty sea breeze wafting in through the open windows. Liam was at the counter, pouring a second cup as I walked in. "Here," he said, handing it to me. "Thanks," I murmured, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. We sat at the small table, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. Finally, Liam broke the silence. "We should talk," he said, his voice careful. I nodded, my stomach twisting. "I know." He set his mug down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I meant everything I said last night," he began. "I care about you, Meredith. More than I probably should. But I don't regret what happened." I looked down at my coffee, my chest tightening. "It's not that simple," I said softly. "I know it's not," he replied, his tone steady. "But that doesn't mean it's wrong." I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "What if it is?" "What if it isn't?" he countered, his gaze unwavering. "What if this is exactly what we both need?" The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear, and I felt the tears spill over, streaking down my cheeks. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "But I need you to know that I'm here. Whatever happens, I'm here." The warmth of his hand against mine steadied me, and for the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of hope. The rest of the day passed in a quiet blur. We didn't talk much, but Liam stayed close, his presence a constant reassurance. In the afternoon we took a walk along the beach, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. At one point, as we stood at the edge of the water, Liam turned to me, his expression serious. "Let's leave," he said suddenly. I blinked, startled. "What?" "Let's leave this place," he said, his voice firm. "This town, this house, everything. Let's start over somewhere new." "Liam," he stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Think about it," he said softly. "We could go somewhere no one knows us. We could build a life together, without all the judgment, without the past hanging over us." The idea was as terrifying as it was tempting, and I felt my chest tighten. "I don't know if I can just walk away," I said, my voice trembling. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently. "But promise me you'll think about it." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. "Okay," I said finally. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself leaning into Liam's side, his arm draped loosely around my shoulders. "You're quiet," he said softly. "I'm just thinking," I replied. "About what?" "About what comes next," I admitted. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his touch steady and reassuring. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together," he said. For the first time, I let myself believe him. The next morning, as I packed my bags, I caught a glimpse of the necklace Liam had bought me at the market. I slipped it over my head, the cool metal resting against my skin like a quiet reminder of everything we had shared. When Liam appeared in the doorway, his smile was soft but filled with certainty. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, my heart racing. "Ready." As we left the house and walked toward his truck, I felt a mix of fear and hope swirling inside me. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was stepping toward something, instead of away from it. With Liam by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. It happened in the kitchen on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was standing on my tiptoes, reaching for the top shelf of the cabinet, rearranging dishes that hadn't been touched in years. The faint hum of the radio filled the space, one of those easy listening stations I'd always kept on for company. It was supposed to be a simple task, one of the dozens I used to fill the quiet spaces in my day. Then Evan walked in. I didn't hear him at first. His steps were quiet, deliberate, the way they always were. I only noticed him when I turned to grab the next stack of plates and saw him leaning casually against the counter, his arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm, teasing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly, my cheeks flushing as I realized how flustered I sounded. He stepped closer, reaching past me for the glass on the shelf above my head. The movement was smooth, natural, but it brought him so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the earthy warmth of the rain outside. "Here," he said, handing me the glass, his voice quieter now. "Thanks," I murmured, but my voice faltered, my breath catching as his hand brushed against mine. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us shifted, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His eyes met mine, and the look in them made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a glance, it was searching, deliberate, like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned quickly to set the glass on the counter. My heart was pounding, and I hated how obvious it felt. "You've been busy," he said, his tone easy as he leaned against the counter. "It keeps me out of trouble," I replied, forcing a smile. "Trouble?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as the troublemaking type." I laughed, the sound more nervous than I intended. "Not anymore, at least." He didn't say anything, just watched me with that same faint smirk, his gaze steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. Evan had only been living with me for a month, but his presence in the house had already turned my carefully curated world upside down. When my husband, Richard, passed away 6 years ago, I'd spent the first few years drowning in the quiet. The house had been too big, too empty, and I'd filled it with routines and distractions, gardening, cooking, cleaning, anything to keep myself from thinking too much. It worked for a while, but then Evan came back. He'd called one evening out of the blue, his voice hesitant as he explained his situation. His tech job in Seattle had fallen through, his lease was up, and he needed a place to land for a while, until he figured out his next steps. I could still remember the way he'd paused after asking, as though he were afraid I might say no. The next morning, the storm was gone, leaving the world outside fresh and quiet. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the rain-soaked garden, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing my coffee cup, the weight of the night before settled heavily on me. My reflection in the window was as familiar as always. But there was something different about the woman staring back at me. Something softer, something unsure. I had crossed a line, and though I didn't regret it, I couldn't ignore the questions clawing at the edges of my mind. What happens now? I didn't hear him come into the room, but I felt his presence before I turned around. Evan was standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked younger in the morning light, less guarded, and for a moment I let myself just take him in. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, setting the cup down and wiping my hands on a dish towel. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were testing the waters. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I nodded, though the truth was I wasn't sure how much of the night I'd actually spent sleeping. "Did you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He moved to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against it, his gaze fixed on me. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but it carried so much weight, and I felt my chest tighten under the pressure of it. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded as though he'd expected that answer. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to figure everything out right now." His words were a relief, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. "Last night," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "Was real," he finished for me, his voice firm but kind. I looked up at him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "It's not that simple, Evan." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But it doesn't mean it wasn't real." He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, the warmth of his hand grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "We'll figure it out. Together." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "This is scary," I whispered. "I know," he said, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand, "but you don't have to do it alone." We stood there in the quiet, the sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of the world outside distant and muffled. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. A fragile, tentative kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "I just want you to know that I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be." His words stayed with me long after he left the room, echoing in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden. For years I'd told myself that I was fine on my own, that I didn't need anyone else. I'd built a life around that belief, one that was quiet and safe, but empty in ways I hadn't let myself acknowledge. But now, with Evan's words still lingering in the air, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. Was it possible to let myself feel again? To let myself be vulnerable? The thought scared me, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. When I finally stood, the house was quiet, the weight of the night before still settling over it like a blanket. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I was ready to face what came next. But as I looked out at the garden, the sunlight glinting off the rain-soaked leaves, I felt a small, tentative flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to let myself be happy. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to take a chance. Of course I hadn't. He was family. Well, technically. I had married Richard when Evan was already 16, a tall, gangly teenager with a quick wit and a quiet charm. We'd gotten along easily enough, though he'd always kept a respectful distance, never quite letting me in. After Richard's death, we drifted even further apart, our occasional phone calls polite but distant. Now, seeing him as an adult, I could barely reconcile the boy I remembered with the man standing in front of me. He was confident in a way that felt effortless. His sharp features softened by an easy smile that seemed to disarm everyone he met. But there was a depth to him, a quiet vulnerability that he rarely let slip, and it tugged at something in me I couldn't explain. "You've been quiet today," Evan said, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the observation. "Have I?" He nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah. Something on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. How could I explain the jumble of emotions his presence had stirred in me? The way he seemed to unravel years of carefully constructed solitude with nothing more than a smile. "Just thinking about how much needs to be done around here," I said finally, deflecting. "Let me know if you need help," he said, his voice warm but casual. "Thanks," I replied, turning back to the cabinet to avoid his gaze. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen. The warmth in his voice, the subtle weight of his presence. It wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. For years I'd told myself that I didn't need anyone else, that I was content with the life I'd built. But now, with Evan here, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but his face lingered in my mind, and for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever. The days that followed felt like walking through a maze, each turn more confusing than the last. Evan was everywhere. Not in an invasive way, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. I'd wake up to find him in the kitchen, sipping coffee at the table, his hair messy from sleep, and his bare feet tapping lightly against the floor. He always greeted me with the same easy smile, the kind that seemed to linger long after he'd left the room. Then there were the small things. The way he reached for plates while we set the table, his hand brushing against mine as if by accident. The quiet moments where he'd catch my eye and hold my gaze just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into every look, every word. But the truth was he had unsettled something in me. Something I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The weather had cooled slightly, the crispness of early autumn creeping into the air. I was tending to the roses, carefully trimming away the dead leaves, when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I turned to see him standing at the edge of the patio, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked casual, relaxed, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "I've got it," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. He didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer, crouching beside me and reaching for the pruning shears. "I'll do the heavy lifting," he said, his tone teasing. I sighed, handing them over. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "Must run in the family," he replied with a grin. We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the soft rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds filling the air. At one point I reached for a fallen rose, and our hands brushed against each other. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. But he had. "Sorry," he said softly, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It's fine," I replied, turning back to the roses. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Later that evening, we ended up in the kitchen again, cleaning up after dinner. It had become something of a routine, me washing the dishes, him drying them. It was a small gesture, but one I appreciated more than I let on. "You don't have to help, you know," I said as I handed him a plate. "I know," he replied, his tone light, "but I like being useful." I smiled despite myself, focusing on the warm water running over my hands. "You've always been that way." "Maybe," he said, leaning against the counter as he dried the plate, "but I think you bring it out in me." I glanced at him, startled by the comment. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady as he watched me. "Don't look so surprised," he said with a faint smile. "You're easy to be around." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I focused on the sink, scrubbing the same plate longer than necessary. "I mean it," he added, his voice softer now. "You make this place feel like home." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. For years, I'd convinced myself that I was fine on my own, that the life I'd built was enough. But in that moment, hearing those words from him, I realized how much I'd been craving connection, even if I hadn't let myself admit it. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. The next day, the tension between us seemed to grow. It wasn't overt. Nothing had been said or done to cross any lines, but it was there, in the way he lingered in the doorway while I read on the couch, or the way his hand brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hall. "I didn't hear you come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The storm woke me up," he replied, stepping further into the room. His gaze shifted to the matches in my hand, and his lips curved into a faint smile. "You okay?" "Just startled," I said, straightening. "Let me," he said, reaching out to take the matches from me. Our hands brushed as he did, his fingers grazing mine in a way that felt unreasonably intimate. I froze, the air between us suddenly thick with something unspoken. He struck the match, the sudden flare of light illuminating his face, and for a moment I was struck by how easily he seemed to fill the room. He lit the candle and set it on the counter, the warm glow casting soft shadows on the walls. "There," he said, his voice quiet. "Thanks," I murmured, but my words felt hollow. My chest was tight, my thoughts tangled in a way I couldn't untangle. "Storms like this always make the house feel different," he said, leaning against the counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes were on me, steady and watchful. "Different how?" I asked, grateful for the distraction. "Quieter," he said after a moment. "Like it's holding its breath." I nodded, understanding what he meant more than I wanted to admit. He didn't move, didn't say anything else, and the silence stretched between us until it felt almost unbearable. "Do you want some tea?" I asked, the words tumbling out too quickly. "Sure," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. I busied myself with the kettle, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. But even as I moved around the kitchen, I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting. When the tea was ready, I handed him a mug, careful not to let our hands touch. He accepted it with a quiet, "Thanks," his fingers brushing against mine anyway. We sat at the table, the candle flickering between us, the storm raging outside. He leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around the mug, his expression thoughtful. "You're quiet tonight," he said finally. "Just tired," I replied, though the words felt hollow. "You've been saying that a lot lately," he said, his tone soft but probing. I didn't know how to respond, so I took a sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "I worry about you, you know," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. His words caught me off guard, and I looked up at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Why?" "Because you don't let anyone in," he said simply. "You keep everything bottled up like you're afraid to let anyone see the real you." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down I knew he was right. "You don't have to do that with me," he said, his gaze locked on mine. "You don't have to pretend." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "It's not that simple," I said quietly. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because I'm scared," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but you don't have to be." His hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Evan," I began, but my voice faltered. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. I want you to know that I'm here. For you. No matter what." His words lingered in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "You just have to let yourself feel it." The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, the sound of the rain and thunder drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I let myself see the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet sincerity in his voice. It scared me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. "Can we just—" I trailed off, unsure of what I was even asking. "Take it one step at a time," he finished for me, his lips curving into a small, understanding smile. I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. When he finally stood, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment before he turned to leave, I felt the air rush back into my lungs. "Good night, Marianne," he said softly, his voice warm and steady. "Good night," I replied. my voice barely above a whisper. As he disappeared down the hall, I stayed where I was, staring at the candle's flickering flame. My heart was still pounding, and my thoughts were still tangled. But for the first time in years, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from this. The morning after the storm brought a strange kind of clarity. The air outside was crisp and clean, the sunlight breaking through the lingering gray clouds to illuminate the garden. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual, as though it too were holding its breath. I spent most of the morning in the kitchen, my hands busy kneading dough for a loaf of bread. The rhythm of the task was soothing, and I focused on it with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, desperate for something to drown out the whirlwind of thoughts in my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Evan had looked at me the night before. The quiet sincerity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the gentle brush of his hand against mine. He didn't make an appearance until nearly noon, and when he did, it was with the same easy confidence that seemed to come so naturally to him. He walked into the kitchen barefoot, his hair slightly messy, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but casual. "Morning," I replied, my tone brisk as I turned back to the counter. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he watched me. "You've been up early." "I had things to do," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Looks like you're doing everything," he said with a faint smile, nodding toward the counter where the dough sat. "You always do." His words struck a nerve, and I turned to face him, my hands still dusted with flour. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you take on too much," he said simply, his gaze steady. "You're always trying to do everything yourself." "Someone has to," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why does it always have to be you?" he asked, stepping into the room. I didn't have an answer for that, so I turned back to the dough, pressing my hands into it with more force than necessary. "You don't have to do it all alone," he said softly, his voice closer now. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my chest tighten. "I'm used to it," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "That doesn't mean it's right," he replied. I froze, my hands stilling against the dough as his words sank in. He was close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, and when I turned to look at him, the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to keep shutting people out." The vulnerability in his voice broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. "You don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't let myself feel," he finished for me, his tone gentle but insistent. I nodded, my chest tight with the weight of everything I'd been holding back. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his hand reaching out to rest lightly on my arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my defenses begin to crumble. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us thick and unspoken. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "Just let yourself feel it. That's all I'm asking." His words were a lifeline, pulling me toward something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "Evan," I began, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer, his hand sliding down to clasp mine. "It's okay," he said, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. "We can take it slow." The moment was interrupted by the sound of the oven timer going off, the sharp beep cutting through the quiet. I stepped back quickly, breaking the connection, and turned to pull the tray of bread from the oven. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing there, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "Anytime." That evening, the tension between us reached its peak. We were sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. The conversation had started light, small talk about the weather, his plans for the week, but it didn't stay that way for long. "You've been distant today," he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I'm not distant," I replied, though the words felt hollow even to me. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You're a terrible liar, Marianne." I sighed, setting my glass on the coffee table. It's just a lot to process, I admitted. I know, he said softly, his voice laced with understanding. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he met my gaze. You don't have to have all the answers, he said. But you have to stop running from this. This? I asked, my voice trembling. Us, he said simply. The word hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. There's no us, I said quickly, shaking my head. There could be, he replied, his voice steady. I looked away, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. It's not that simple, I whispered. It doesn't have to be, he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against mine. It just has to be real. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made my resolve falter, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Evan, It's okay, he said softly, his hand closing gently around mine. We'll figure it out together. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my mind. We'll figure it out together. For the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. It was late that night when it finally happened, the moment I'd been running from for weeks. The storm that had passed earlier seemed to have left something charged in the air, and though the house was quiet, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I was in the kitchen again, leaning against the counter with a glass of water, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The day had been heavy, too many words left unsaid, too many moments where the tension between us had felt too much to bear. And though I'd tried to ignore it, to push it down, it lingered, pressing against my chest with every passing hour. I didn't hear him at first. He moved so quietly, his steps barely audible against the wooden floor. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway, his hair mussed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You're still up, he said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. I couldn't sleep, I replied, setting the glass down on the counter. He stepped into the room, the faint scent of rain still clinging to him. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, and yet there was something about him, something unguarded, almost vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. Me neither, he said, leaning against the counter opposite me. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick and unspoken. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting, and though I told myself to look away, I couldn't. What's keeping you up? He asked finally, his voice low. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Just a lot on my mind, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Is it about me? He asked, his tone gentle but direct. The question hit me like a wave, and I felt my breath catch. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to put into words the mess of emotions swirling inside me. Evan, I began, but the words faltered. It's okay, he said softly, stepping closer. You don't have to say anything, He paused, his gaze searching mine, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I just need you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't. His confession hung in the air, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. This is complicated, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said, his tone steady, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. I shook my head, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. You're my stepson, Evan. This isn't supposed to happen. I'm not your son, he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. Not really. And even if I was, that wouldn't change how I feel about you. His words broke something in me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to know, he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt myself leaning into it before I could stop myself. I'm scared, I whispered, my voice breaking. I know, he said softly, his hand sliding down to cup my face. But you don't have to be, not with me. His words made my chest ache, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant and searching, but it quickly deepened, his arms wrapping around me as though he were afraid to let go. His hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him. The warmth of his touch chasing away the fear and doubt that had been weighing me down for so long. When we pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. If this isn't what you want, just say the word and I'll walk away. I looked at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. I don't want you to stop, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His lips found mine again, more confident this time, and I felt his hand slide up to cradle my face, his touch both firm and reverent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an unraveling, a release of everything we'd been holding back. He guided me toward the couch, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into the warmth and security of his embrace. His hands moved with quiet reverence, exploring the curves of my body in a way that made me feel cherished, wanted, alive. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the intensity of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice breaking through the haze. Yes, I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of nerves and desire. His lips found mine again, and for the first time in years, I let myself surrender completely. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that made my chest ache. It was the way he whispered my name, soft and reverent, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. And when it was over, when we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of the candlelight casting soft shadows across our skin, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. Are you okay? He asked again, his voice softer this time. I think so, I said, my head resting against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. I meant what I said, he murmured. I'm here for as long as you'll let me be. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This is scary, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to do it alone. As the storm outside began to fade, the thunder growing distant, I lay there in his arms, the sound of his heartbeat steadied beneath my ear. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was enough. And for now, that was all I needed.